In the 1830s, the trails west, Santa Fe, Oregon, and others, were choked with wagons. Wooden wheels, canvas tops, dust rising so thick it marked the land for miles. Families were heading west in numbers no one had seen before. One of those families was the Parkers. Like many frontier families, the Parkers sought land to build a life. They moved with the frontier, from Illinois to Missouri, and eventually into Mexican Texas. After gaining independence from Spain, Mexico encouraged American settlers to move into Texas, a vast region it claimed, but struggled to control. Texas seemed promising and orderly on maps. Frontiers usually do.
So it was with a great sense of hope and pride that the Parkers established a military-like fort in central Texas, along the Navasota River, well inside Comanche raiding territory, but just beyond the edge of Anglo settlement. White American families pushing into Comanche territory. They built their fort and went about their lives, farming, worshiping, raising families, believing they had finally found a place to stop and live. What they couldn't have known was what their presence meant to the people who already lived there. You didn't just pass through or settle this land. You were allowed to. Notices like this circulated across the South and Midwest. They promised land, order, and safety. On paper, Texas looked settled. Frontiers usually do. So families packed their lives into wagons and moved west, believing they were stepping into opportunity. One of those families was the Parkers. They built Fort Parker deep in Comanche territory, believing the promises were real. It was a sunny May morning, mere months after revolution had swept through Texas. Benjamin Parker left the fort and the front gate ajar to address the raiding party of between 100 and 300 warriors who had gathered outside the fort. Sources differ on the exact makeup of the raiding party, but all agree it was led by Comanche warriors. He believed their intentions were peaceful. What followed shattered those assumptions and set off consequences that would echo across the American Southwest. 5 settlers were killed, 3 captives were taken, including Cynthia Ann Parker. There's something that needs to be addressed here, because this story intersects with 2 very different captivity narratives. One of the most famous is that of Herman Lehman. He was taken as a child, and according to his own account, the Comanche man who took him was Chivato. Lehman's story became widely known because it ended the way white audiences expected it to end, with a return, with reassurance, with closure. But another child taken during this same area was Cynthia Ann Parker, and her story did not end that way. Cynthia didn't survive captivity. She was absorbed into a different world. She was adopted, she built a life, she became Comanche, and that difference matters. Taking children during raids wasn't random cruelty. It was part of how plain societies replaced losses from war and disease, strengthened families, and ensured survival in a violent frontier shaped by colonial pressure. That doesn't make it painless. It doesn't make it acceptable by modern standards, but it does make it intelligible. And the consequence of Cynthia's life, not her capture, but her belonging, was a son named Quanah. To understand Quanah, you have to understand the world that raised his mother, and the stories America chose to remember and forget. History doesn't ask us to approve, it asks us to understand. From that world, not from Texas, a child was born. Around 1845, Cynthia Ann Parker gave birth to a son named Quanah. He would only take the name Parker later in life. Quanah did not grow up between 2 cultures. He grew up inside one. He spoke Comanche. He rode before he could remember learning. He learned to hunt, to raid, to endure hunger, heat, and long distances without complaint. This was not a childhood built around comfort. It was built around survival and honor. Quanah was raised in Comancheria, near its height, when the Comanche controlled vast stretches of the southern plains, dictated movement, extracted tribute, and defended their territory with unmatched mobility. This was not a defeated people. This was a horse culture at full power, an empire of the plains. Quanah learned early what it meant to be Comanche. Loyalty to band and kin, courage in battle, generosity in peace, and reputation, because reputation was survival. Your name mattered, your word mattered, your endurance mattered, and Quanah had something else, something rare, but not isolating. He had a mother who remembered another world. Cynthia Ann Parker did not raise Quanah to be Anglo. She raised him to survive. But through her, Quanah learned the world beyond Comancheria was not a myth. It was a force, moving closer every year. As Quanah grew, so did the pressure. Buffalo herds shrank. Settlers multiplied. Armies arrived. And the world Quanah was being trained to inherit, the world of mounted warfare and open plains, was already under siege. Still, Quanah proved himself. He became known for his intelligence, his discipline, and his ability to lead, not through bluster, but through example. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. And that quality, more than his ancestry, would define what came next. Because Quanah, later known to history as Quanah Parker, would be forced to do something no Comanche leader before him ever had to do: decide how to survive the end of a world. That moment came in the 1870s. What followed is known as the Red River War, though war hardly captures what it was. It wasn't a single battle. It was a sustained campaign. The United States Army set out to do what it had failed to do for decades: break Comanche power by destroying the foundations of Comanche life. They targeted horse herds, winter camps, food supplies, and most devastating of all, the buffalo. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about starvation. The slaughter of the buffalo wasn't collateral damage. It was a strategy designed to starve the Plains tribes into submission. By modern standards, that tactic has a name. Quanah was no bystander. By this time, he had already proven himself as a warrior and leader, disciplined, strategic, and respected. He understood the land. He understood mobility, and he understood that survival still depended upon resistance. Quanah fought. He led raids. He protected camps. He tried to hold together a world that was being systematically dismantled. But this was not the frontier warfare of earlier generations. The U.S. Army did not need to win every fight. It only needed to endure longer. Railroads delivered supplies. Buffalo rifles emptied the plains. Winter closed in. By 1875, the reality was unavoidable. Comanche independence, not courage, not skill, not honor, was being defeated by logistics. Quanah faced a decision no Comanche leader before him had ever faced: continue fighting and watch his people starve, or surrender and try to preserve what could still be saved. He chose survival. In 1875, Quanah led his band to Fort Sill and surrendered to the United States Army. This is often framed as defeat, but that framing misses the point. What Quanah did next mattered more than what he could no longer do, because surrender could not end his leadership. It transformed it. Surrender didn't mean peace. It meant arrival. At Fort Sill, Quanah and his people entered a world that did not move the way theirs had. There were no long rides, no scouting ahead, no choice about where to camp next. The land was fixed. The days were counted. Food no longer came from the hunt. It came from a line. Sometimes the rations were late. Sometimes they were spoiled. Sometimes they were things the body wasn't used to eating at all. Warriors who had measured themselves by distance, endurance, and risk now waited, hungry, for permission to survive. Children adapted quickly. Elders adapted slowly. For young men raised in motion, stillness was the hardest adjustment of all. This wasn't the loss of freedom in a dramatic sense. It was quieter than that. It was the loss of purpose. On the reservation, violence didn't disappear. It was managed. Young men who had been raised to hunt buffalo, to ride for days, to read the land and wind, to prove endurance, were sometimes permitted supervised hunts, not of buffalo, but of penned cattle. It was meant as a release, a way to pacify instincts the government no longer allowed to exist. But a hunt without danger, without distance, without meeting, wasn't a hunt at all. Elders watched in silence. Young men went through the motions. Some feigned bravado to mask the embarrassment everyone understood, but no one named. What had once been earned was now permitted, and everyone understood what had been lost. In a world where hunger had replaced the hunt and permission had replaced honor, something had to take the place of war without becoming it. At that moment, peyote entered the story. By the time Quanah reached the reservation, this wasn't the first time peyote had crossed his path. It had already moved quietly through Comanche networks, carried by people who understood survival long before surrender. One of them was Chivato. You already know his name. He didn't bring peyote as an escape. He brought it as discipline. It demanded fasting, endurance, all-night vigilance. It asked young men to suffer, but to suffer with meaning. This wasn't intoxication. It wasn't retreat from reality. It was something strong when strength could no longer look the way it used to. Peyote did not go unnoticed. As ceremonies spread and stabilized people, federal agents and missionaries began to push back. They called it intoxication. They called it dangerous. They called it proof that native people could not be trusted to govern themselves. The same system that had replaced the hunt with rations now moved to outlaw the one thing holding people together. Quanah understood what was at stake. This was no longer just a spiritual question. It was a political one. So he adapted again. Quanah traveled east to Washington, not as a defeated warrior, but as a representative of a people who were still here. He spoke plainly. He argued that peyote was not a vice, but a religion, that it encouraged sobriety, responsibility, and restraint, that it reduced violence rather than causing it. He didn't ask permission to exist. He argued for the right to continue. This wasn't resistance in the colonial sense. It was defense by another name. When culture could no longer defend itself with force, it learned to defend itself with law. At the same time, Quanah understood the power of visibility. He cultivated relationships. He hosted officials. He allowed himself to be seen. In 1905, Quanah Parker attended the inauguration of Theodore Roosevelt, not as a curiosity, not as a relic, but as a leader whose presence could no longer be ignored. Visibility became a kind of protection. Quanah also learned to survive economically. With the buffalo gone, he turned to cattle. He became wealthy, not by abandoning his people, but by learning how the new world worked. That gave him leverage. It gave him independence. It allowed him to help others. Survival, once again, meant adaptation, not surrender. Through all this, Quanah never forgot his mother. Cynthia Ann Parker was taken from the world that raised her and forced back into one that no one longer knew. Quanah refused that erasure. He spoke of her. He remembered her. And when the time came, he asked to be buried alongside her Comanche family, not separated from them. That choice mattered, because it said something simple and final. This was who he was. Quanah Parker died in 1911. By then, the world that made him had long since vanished. But the people had not. Quanah Parker is often remembered as the last chief of the Comanche, but last implies an ending. Quanah was not the end of something. He was proof that survival could be deliberate, that dignity could exist without victory, that leadership didn't always look like resistance, and that adaptation was not betrayal. He did not save the old world. No one could. But he saved his people inside the new one. History doesn't ask us to approve. It asks us to understand. If you're still here, thank you. There's more where this came from. I've got stories that your history books left out. Drop a like. Subscribe if you haven't already. This is the Underground Syllabus.